SpaceX launches a one-of-a-kind lunar rideshare mission, Rocket Lab unveils the latest on Neutron, including a landing barge and fairing testing, NASA's next asteroid hunter finally gets its own ride to space, and Starship's next launch has been delayed to next week. We've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. During an earnings call with investors, Rocket Lab announced that it's building a boat for its Neutron rocket and revealed a new satellite design for a big constellation. The company's been doing well. Last year, it massively increased Electron's launch cadence, signed some big contracts, and made more revenue than ever before. Now that's all great news, but of course we're a bit more interested in the other announcements. Rocket Lab is working on its reusable medium-lift rocket, a methane-powered carbon composite beast called Neutron. The company first announced the rocket 4 years ago, and it's slowly getting closer and closer to its first launch. One of Neutron's key features is the way that its fairing is recovered. The fairing encapsulates and protects the payload on ascent, but is no longer needed once the rocket reaches space. Now, most rockets dispose of this fairing at this point. SpaceX reuses them by scooping up the fairing halves out of the water, but for Neutron, the fairing stays with the first stage all the way until landing. This approach has led to a unique fairing design, which Rocket Lab calls the Hungry Hippo. The company has recently been testing this concept at full speed, and a video released alongside the earnings call shows the mechanism open and close. With some imagination, it really does look like a big hippo mouth. But this first stage and fairing combo needs to land somewhere, and for that, Rocket Lab showed off its ocean landing platform. It's a big barge, much like SpaceX's drone ships and Blue Origin's Jacqueline landing vessel. Rocket Lab calls the ship Return on Investment and expects it to enter service in 2026. It won't be needed for the rocket's first launch though, as that will perform a soft splashdown to test the waters before the company commits to an actual landing. Rocket Lab still expects that first flight to happen this year, but it's also under investigation as some investors doubt that the company will be able to meet this promise. But it's clear that Rocket Lab is trying to get off the ground. It's making progress with its rocket's engines, including shaving off more than 200 kilograms in unnecessary mass from each. Neutron's launch pad will be ready soon, and Rocket Lab has even started production on the rocket for the second flight. There was one more interesting announcement this week, and that's a payload for Neutron that Rocket Lab has been teasing for a while. It's a new satellite platform called Flatellite, ideal for large constellations. Rocket Lab wants to provide low-latency, high-speed connectivity and remote sensing capability to commercial, national security, and defense customers. The way Flatellite stacks into Neutron's fairing is also very reminiscent of Starlink. Starlink has allowed SpaceX to reach an unprecedented launch cadence, so it's not surprising that Rocket Lab is looking for something similar. The announcement of Flatellite hopefully means that we'll see Neutron fly many, many times. And that's great! We love rocket launches around here! You may have noticed that we've been talking about asteroids a lot lately because we've been following that one that'll get close to Earth in 2032. Last week, we reported that the chance of the asteroid actually hitting our home planet was rapidly decreasing, and now this probability is down to 0.001%. In other words, the chance of impact is down to 1 in 100,000, so there's really no reason for concern anymore. Now, while we're safe from this one, there are likely many other asteroids that haven't been spotted yet. To better understand the threat that these asteroids pose, NASA has been working on a mission that'll scour the solar system in search of hazardous asteroids and comets, and this week, NASA announced that it has awarded the launch contract for this mission to SpaceX. The mission is called Near-Earth Object Surveyor, or NEO Surveyor for short, and it's a successor to NASA's NEOWISE mission, which ended last year. NEO Surveyor is a small space telescope that'll orbit the stable L1 Lagrange point between the Earth and the Sun. From there, it'll survey the solar system for 5 years, looking for asteroids and comets larger than 140 meters across. NASA hopes that NEO Surveyor will find at least 2/3 of the ones that we haven't spotted before. The telescope is outfitted with 2 infrared detectors, which allow NEO Surveyor to make accurate measurements of the object's sizes, shapes, orbits, and compositions. It'll not only be able to detect bright objects, but also dark ones. The telescopes that are currently searching for asteroids and comets struggle to detect these dark objects, so NEO Surveyor is poised to shed some light on the situation. And now this telescope has a rocket and a launch date. Under the new contract, SpaceX is set to launch NEO Surveyor on a Falcon 9 no earlier than September of 2027. Meanwhile, another NASA mission is currently approaching an asteroid for a quick visit in a couple of months. The agency's Lucy spacecraft launched in 2021 on a mission to the Trojan asteroids that lead and trail Jupiter in its orbit around the Sun. But on its way there, the spacecraft will first visit some asteroids in the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. This week, Lucy got eyes on its next target for the very first time. The asteroid is known as Donaldjohanson, and it was named after the paleoanthropologist who discovered the famous fossilized skeleton Lucy in Ethiopia in 1974. The skeleton is of an early pre-human ancestor from 3.2 million years ago and was named Lucy after its discovery in honor of the Beatles' song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Just as this fossil shared unique insights into our own human evolution, the aptly named Lucy mission promises to expand our knowledge of planetary origins. Lucy is currently 70 million kilometers away from the asteroid, but its cameras have already spotted it. On 2 images taken on February 20th and 22nd, Donaldjohanson can be seen as a bright dot moving with respect to the stationary background stars. There's also another dot that shows up in only the first picture, and that's actually another asteroid that just happened to photobomb it, and it was out of the frame by the 22nd. Lucy is set to pass by the asteroid on April 20th, with its closest approach within 1,000 kilometers. By then, Lucy will be able to observe some details on the asteroid's surface, and based on its previous asteroid visit, it might have some surprises in store. In late 2023, Lucy passed by another main belt asteroid called Dinkinesh, and the photos it sent back revealed something unexpected. Dinkinesh had a moon. And it wasn't just any moon, but a so-called contact binary made of 2 touching objects held together by gravity. For now, Donaldjohanson is just a bright speck in Lucy's view, but we may get to see something truly amazing in just a few months. The asteroid is Lucy's final stop before the spacecraft arrives at the first of the Jovian Trojans in August of 2027. China is also getting ready to visit an asteroid on the Tianwen-2 mission, and we recently got an update on the mission's status. Tianwen-2 plans to visit an asteroid called Komo'o-11. It's a near-Earth object, just like the ones that we talked about earlier, and in fact this one orbits the Sun so closely to our planet that it's considered a quasi-satellite. It's too far to be considered a natural satellite or a moon, but it never wanders farther than about 100 times the distance to the moon. Studies from Earth reveal that the asteroid is very similar in composition to the moon, leading some scientists to believe that it actually might have just split off from our celestial companion a long time ago. Tianwen-2 is going to shed light on the situation by collecting a sample from the asteroid's surface. The spacecraft will then return to Earth and drop off a capsule with the sample so it can be studied by scientists here on the ground. But that won't be the end of the Tianwen-2 mission. The spacecraft will then make its way to the asteroid belt, where it will visit an active asteroid known as 311P Pan-STARRS. An active asteroid is a type of asteroid that's similar to a comet and is therefore known as a main belt comet. In this case, the asteroid ejects material that then forms a set of comet-like tails. The Tianwen-2 spacecraft has now arrived at the Xichang Satellite Launch Center and is being prepared for launch in the first half of this year. We'll of course cover Tianwen-2 as it happens in future episodes. And if you want to follow along with this mission and other space news, there should be a subscribe button nearby. Oh, and I think there's a like button too. Now we'll take a glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with the Australian rocket company Gilmour Space, which is getting ready for its first launch. The company's been working on a rocket called Eris, which has 3 stages and is powered by Gilmour Space's own hybrid rocket engine. The rocket is 25 meters tall and can deliver up to 305 kilograms into low Earth orbit. Gilmour has now received the final airspace approvals for the rocket's maiden flight from its own launch site, the Bowen Orbital Spaceport in North Queensland. The launch is expected no earlier than March 15th. If Eris makes it into orbit on its first flight, it'll be the first Australian rocket to do so. But it won't be the first rocket to launch into orbit from Australia. That was achieved by the British Black Arrow in 1971. Unfortunately, its success didn't last, but not because of the rocket. The program was cancelled, leaving the UK with the questionable honor of being the only country to abandon its orbital launch capability. Hopefully Eris's story will see more successes than Black Arrow's, and we're certainly excited to see how that story begins in just a few weeks. The European Space Agency has successfully completed its test campaign for the Throttleable Liquid Propulsion Demonstrator, or TLPD. This is a small rocket engine built by the Polish Łukasiewicz Research Network Institute of Aviation for ESA's Future Launchers Preparatory Program. The TLPD can throttle all the way down to 10% of its optimal thrust level and up to 110%. What's more, it can also restart and is powered by non-toxic and easily storable propellants. These properties make it ideal for spacecraft, kick stages, small rockets, or even missions that will land on moons or planets. The engine performed its first test campaign last year with a passively cooled combustion chamber. It was designed to endure the short tests of the first campaign, but it actually stayed cooler than expected, so teams performed some of the throttling tests ahead of schedule. However, the passively cooled combustion chamber wouldn't cut it for the second test campaign. For that, a water-cooled chamber was designed and 3D printed. This chamber was tested in November, and this week, ESA released footage from that test campaign. The TLPD performed flawlessly, and because of that success, the demonstrator will be upgraded to a flight-like engine. This will be done over the next 2 years with a budget of 5 million euros. Now let's take a look at the space traffic of the week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. It's been quite a busy week. Let's start off from China with our first launch. A Changzheng 3BE took off on February 22nd at 12:11 UTC from Launch Complex 2 at the Xichang Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying the ChinaSat-10R communications satellite into a geosynchronous transfer orbit. ChinaSat-10R will replace the aging ChinaSat-10 satellite that was launched back in 2011. From China, we go to the US at Vandenberg, where SpaceX launched the first of 3 Falcon 9 missions this week on February 23rd at 1:38 UTC. The rocket was carrying 22 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. This was the first launch of a new group of Starlink missions, Group 15, which is characterized by launching batches of Starlink V2 mini satellites into a 70-degree inclination orbit. This is the first time SpaceX has dedicated a launch of Starlink V2 mini satellites into this orbital inclination, as it's not part of the current Starlink constellation, but rather from the original one. Between 2021 and 2023, SpaceX launched 8 missions into this shell using Starlink V1.5 satellites under the umbrella of the Group 2 missions. These higher inclination orbits allow Starlink satellites to cover locations on the globe closer to the poles. With the Group 15 missions, SpaceX will be able to replace the old V1.5 satellites with the new and much more improved Starlink V2 minis, offering better coverage to those higher latitudes of the globe. The first stage for this mission, B1082, was flight-proven as usual and was flying for an 11th time. It successfully returned to Earth, landing on SpaceX's drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. After that, we had another launch of Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket from the company's launch site in West Texas. The 30th launch of New Shepard started off on February 25th at 15:49 UTC, carrying 6 passengers on a suborbital ride to space. 5 of the 6 passengers for this mission were Jesus Calleja, Elaine Hyde, Tushar Shah, Richard Scott, and Lane Bess. The 6th passenger decided to not disclose their identity, although they can be seen wearing Blue Origin's flight gear with stitching that says R. Wilson on it. All but one of the passengers were first-time riders of New Shepard, with Bess having flown previously on the NS-19 mission back in December of 2021. Blue Origin was flying an older New Shepard booster from the fleet, Tail 4, flying for a 13th time on this mission, along with the crew capsule RSS First Step. After those 3 launches, most of the space traffic activity of the week fell on February 27th, with 4 launches and 1 re-entry. What's even more amazing is that the first of these launches went to the moon. A Falcon 9 rocket took off on February 27th at 16 minutes past midnight UTC from Launch Complex 39A in Florida. It was carrying the second Intuitive Machines lunar lander and 3 other rideshares into translunar injection. Intuitive Machines' second Nova C lander, nicknamed Athena, is the 4th in a series of missions under NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services contract, also known as CLPS, and is headed for the southern polar regions of the moon. The company is building upon its experience on the first Nova C mission from last year to deliver another suite of instruments and payloads to the lunar surface for NASA and commercial customers. The main payload flying for NASA is Prime 1, a drilling arm and mass spectrometer experiment slated to gather and analyze samples of lunar soil at a depth of up to 1 meter. Athena also carries a number of private customer payloads, including a lunar surface communications system developed by Nokia, which will test 4G LTE communications on the moon. This system won't just be a mere test article, but will also be used to communicate with one of the other payloads on board Athena, a lunar hopper. Intuitive Machines has developed a small hopper called Micronova and nicknamed Grace that is set to launch off of Athena and hop around the lunar surface using its own propulsion system. Grace will perform a series of hops up to a few kilometers away from Athena and up to 100 meters in altitude. During these hops, it'll be using Nokia's communication system to transmit data back to the lander, which will then relay that information back to Earth. This tiny 40-kilogram hopper also aims to hop into a permanently shadowed crater where Intuitive Machines hopes to find pristine water ice that has never seen the light of the sun. After some initial communications issues post-deployment, Athena has successfully been communicating back to Earth, sending pictures of our own planet and starting up its propulsion system. Unlike some of the other recent lunar landers, Athena will take a direct route to the moon, arriving there on March 3rd. Once in lunar orbit, it'll spend some time performing checkouts and final corrections to align itself with the target landing site in the Mons Mouton region of the moon. The spacecraft is expected to attempt its landing on March 6th and remain active on the surface for 10 days. The 3 rideshares flying on this mission are NASA's Lunar Trailblazer, Astroforge's Odin spacecraft, and Epic Aerospace's Chimera orbital tug. Lunar Trailblazer will insert itself into lunar orbit and start a multi-year mission mapping the distribution of water on our celestial neighbor. Astroforge's Odin spacecraft is planned to fly by the moon and then use its own propulsion to fly by asteroid 2022 OB5. The company aims to eventually carry out asteroid mining missions, and this will be the first of many, aiming to prove many of the systems that will eventually be used for those future missions. That said, as of recording, Astroforge has been having troubles communicating with the spacecraft, so here's hoping that that's just temporary and that everything can continue as planned. While that last launch had quite a lot going on, let's move on to a more familiar one, a good old Starlink mission. Liftoff of Starlink Group 1213 took place on February 27th at 3:34 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40. The mission was carrying 8 Starlink V2 Mini and 13 Starlink direct-to-cell satellites into low Earth orbit. But this wasn't your ordinary Starlink launch, as it flew using a brand new booster. While not yet confirmed, we believe that this booster has serial number B1092, and despite it being new, it certainly knew the instructions when it landed successfully on SpaceX's drone ship Just Read the Instructions. With the 2 Starlink launches this week, SpaceX has now launched a total of 8,039 Starlink satellites, of which 956 have re-entered and 6,340 have moved into their operational orbit. The third launch of the day came from Zhochuan in China, with the Changzheng 2C taking off on February 27th at 7:08 UTC. The rocket was carrying the second pair of SuperView Neo-1 satellites into sun-synchronous orbit. SuperView Neo-1 satellites are Chinese commercial Earth observation satellites with about a half-ton mass at launch and imaging capability of 50 centimeters per pixel. This week, we also had the return to Earth of Varda Space Industries' Winnebago 2 spacecraft. The spacecraft, built by Rocket Lab and based on its Pioneer bus, was launched as part of the Transporter 12 mission in January, and it's been in orbit until just this past week. It consists of a propulsion module and a re-entry capsule, the latter of which hosts a number of payloads involving the manufacturing of pharmaceutical products in microgravity. The capsule also included a payload from the Air Force Research Laboratory to study dynamic plasma during re-entry, using the capsule as a hypersonic testbed. The propulsion module conducted a de-orbit burn on February 27th at 13:52 UTC that initiated the spacecraft's return to Earth. According to the company, capsule separation should have happened at 14:22 UTC, followed 17 minutes later by parachute deployment ahead of a soft touchdown at the Kuniba test range in South Australia. And the final launch of the week took place from Kazakhstan, with a Soyuz 2.1A rocket launching the latest Progress resupply vehicle to the International Space Station. Liftoff happened on February 27th at 21:24 UTC from Site 316 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The Progress MS-30 spacecraft is carrying about 3 tons of food, fuel, and supplies to the orbiting outpost. Prior to the launch of this spacecraft, the Progress MS-28 spacecraft departed the station on February 25th at 2017 UTC. This was done to make way for this latest Progress, which is scheduled to dock to the aft docking port on the Zvezda module on March 1st at 23:03 UTC. The spacecraft will then remain attached to the ISS for about 6 months, adding extra cargo space for the station and providing regular reboosts of its orbit. And barring any surprises, that was the 20th and final launch of February. The world wraps up the second month of the year with a total of 41 launches, 25 of them performed by SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. Coming in second is China, as usual, with a total of 9 launches so far in 2025, and this month we saw the first launches by Japan and Russia, who had yet to launch anything this year. Going into next week, we'll have a lot more activity, starting off with the launch of a Kuaizhou 1A rocket from China. The roughly 45-minute launch window for this mission is set to open on March 1st at 9:51 UTC. Next week in deep space, NASA's Europa Clipper will be flying by Mars as part of its long trek to Jupiter and its moons. Europa Clipper should be coming as close as 884 kilometers from the surface of the red planet, with that closest approach set to happen on March 1st at 17:57 UTC. Down here on Earth, there are a number of Falcon 9 launches scheduled for next week, beginning with a Starlink mission out from Florida. From China, we'll also have a Series 1 rocket taking off from Zhochuan no earlier than March 2nd at 8:10 UTC. Right around that time, Firefly's Blue Ghost lander should be starting its descent to the lunar surface. That landing should be taking place on March 2nd at 8:34 UTC at the Mare Crisium region of the Moon. Next week, there will also be a Soyuz 2.1B launch from Plesetsk carrying the GLONASS K2 No. 14L satellite into a medium Earth orbit. The launch is currently scheduled for an instantaneous launch window on March 2nd at 22:22 UTC. Back in the US, a Falcon 9 will lift off from California on March 3rd at 3:09 UTC. The main passenger on this flight is NASA's spectrophotometer for the history of the universe, Epoch of Reionization and Ices Explorer, or SphereX telescope that will explore the origins of the universe. SphereX will be joined by 4 small satellites for NASA's Punch mission, which will study solar wind. All 5 satellites on this flight will be deployed into sun-synchronous orbits, and the booster will return to its launch site and land at Landing Zone 4. Next, we'll have the second flight of Ariane 6, this time carrying a French reconnaissance satellite into orbit. Liftoff is scheduled for March 3rd at 16:24 UTC from the Guiana Space Center. Also next week, we'll have the 8th launch of SpaceX's Starship rocket. The company had originally targeted February 26th for this launch, which was then moved to February 28th, and more recently was rescheduled to March 3rd. The launch window for that mission will last for roughly 1 hour and open at 5:30 p.m. Central Time or 23:30 UTC. SpaceX moved the Super Heavy booster for this launch, Booster 15, out to the launch site for flight, but has yet to transport the second stage, Ship 34, as of recording. The company aims to carry out what it planned to do on Flight 7, but was never able to accomplish due to Ship 33's breakup during flight. Additionally, just recently, SpaceX received a modified launch license from the FAA, including, for the first time, wording that will allow orbital flights of Starship in the future. As always, we'll be live for launch coverage and also for pre-flight updates through our Countdown to Launch streams. Another Falcon 9 will be launching next week from Florida, carrying more Starlink satellites. The 4-hour launch window is set to open on March 4th at 6:28 UTC. Over on the West Coast, SpaceX is also gearing up to launch its next transporter mission as part of the company's SmallSat rideshare program. The launch is currently scheduled for March 6th at 6:39 UTC, so get your coffee ready for that one. As mentioned earlier, next week we'll also have the landing of Intuitive Machines' Athena lander. The landing is currently scheduled for March 6th, with the exact landing time still undisclosed. And at the end of the week, we'll have yet another Starlink mission from Florida, with a 4-hour launch window set to open on March 7th at 14:09 UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.